Welcome to another scenario of alternative history, thoughts you get before going to sleep. Before we begin this journey through time, I'm curious, where are you listening to us from right now? What time is it where you are? Perhaps it's late evening, the world outside your window growing quiet. Perhaps you're lying in bed, letting your mind wander through possibilities. Whatever the hour, wherever you are, thank you for being here as we explore a world that might have been. Imagine, if you will, the city of Alexandria in the year 48 BCE. The Mediterranean stretches endlessly before the harbor, merchant ships rocking gently in the evening tide. The great lighthouse stands watch over the water, its fire burning bright against the gathering dusk. And inland, rising above the royal quarter, stands a complex of buildings that house the greatest collection of human knowledge ever assembled. Scrolls from Athens and Babylon, from Persia and India, from the furthest reaches of the known world. This is the Library of Alexandria, the museum, the center of learning for the entire Mediterranean world. In our timeline, this library suffered a gradual decline. Fire during Caesar's military campaign damaged portions of it. Later incidents, changing political winds, religious transformations, and ultimately conquest by various powers led to its dissolution. The exact details remain debated by historians, but the result is clear. The library that once held perhaps 400,000 scrolls, the accumulated wisdom of the ancient world, ceased to exist as a functioning institution. Knowledge was scattered, lost, or destroyed. But consider a different path. Imagine that the civil war in Egypt takes a different turn. Perhaps Caesar's forces never set fire to the Egyptian fleet in the harbor, and the flames never spread to the warehouses near the library district. Perhaps cooler heads prevail, and the scholarly quarter is declared neutral ground, protected by all parties. Perhaps a particular librarian, a woman named Thea, whose name history never recorded, convinces the generals that knowledge belongs to no army, that burning books is burning the future itself. The fire never starts. The scrolls remain safe. The scholars continue their work through the night, unaware of how close they came to catastrophe. And from this single moment of preservation, a different world begins to unfold. The librarians and scholars of Alexandria do not yet know it, but they have just changed the course of human civilization. The great repository of learning will endure, and its endurance will reshape everything that follows. The night passes quietly in this Alexandria. The scholars sleep, their precious manuscripts secure. The sailors in the harbor go about their work. The Mediterranean world continues turning, but now on a slightly different axis. Knowledge that would have been lost remains accessible. Texts that would have existed only in fragmentary quotes survive complete. Mathematical treatises, astronomical observations, geographical accounts, medical knowledge, philosophical dialogues, all of it preserved, protected, ready to be studied and built upon by generations yet unborn. As dawn breaks over the library, light streams through the windows of the reading rooms, illuminating rows of carefully organized scrolls. A young scholar from Athens has traveled here to study Euclid's original manuscripts. A physician from Paragon examines medical texts from India. A mathematician from Babylon compares his culture's astronomical tables with those of the Egyptians. The great project of human understanding continues without interruption. This is our point of divergence, a library that survives, knowledge that persists. And from this preservation, an entirely different history will emerge, rippling outward through the centuries like waves from a stone dropped into still water. The immediate effects of the library's survival become apparent within the first generation. The scholars who work within its walls in the decades following 48 BCE do not realize they are living through a historical turning point, but their work benefits enormously from the unbroken continuity of the institution. Where, in our timeline, knowledge began to disperse and fragment, here it continues to accumulate and synthesize. By 30 BCE, when Octavian brings Egypt under Roman control, he finds not a damaged and declining library, but a thriving intellectual center. Unlike our history, where Roman interest in the library was minimal, here Octavian recognizes its value. He has heard reports from his own scholars about the unique texts housed in Alexandria, works available nowhere else in the world. Rather than treating Egypt merely as a grain supplier for Rome, he invests in the library, seeing it as a jewel of his new empire. Roman funding flows into Alexandria. The library expands, new wings are constructed to house additional scrolls. More importantly, a systematic program begins to collect copies of texts from across the growing Roman Empire. Every major work in Latin is copied and sent to Alexandria. In return, Latin translations of Greek texts flow back to Rome. The cross-pollination of Greek and Roman intellectual traditions intensifies beyond what occurred in our timeline. The scholars of this era make discoveries that, in our world, would wait centuries or never come at all. With access to complete sets of astronomical observations spanning generations, mathematicians begin to notice patterns in celestial movements that eluded their counterparts in our timeline. A Syrian scholar named Seleucus, building on Aristarchus's heliocentric model and armed with more complete data, develops mathematical proofs that strongly suggest the Earth orbits the Sun. His work doesn't immediately overturn geocentric models, but it plants seeds of doubt and creates a more robust debate about the structure of the cosmos. Medical knowledge advances more rapidly as well. The anatomical studies begun by Hierapolis and Aristaeus continue with less interruption. Physicians traveling to Alexandria from across the empire bring their own observations and techniques, which are recorded and synthesized with existing medical literature. A more systematic understanding of human anatomy emerges. Surgical techniques improve. The connection between sanitation and disease, partially understood by some ancient physicians, becomes more widely accepted and practiced in major cities. The library also becomes a center for engineering and technological development. The mechanical devices and inventions of Ctesibius and Philo of Byzantium are preserved and studied rather than lost. Hero of Alexandria, working in this enhanced intellectual environment around 60 CE, advances steam power concepts further than in our timeline. While still not producing a full industrial revolution, his work on hydraulics, pneumatics, and automation influences civic engineering across the empire. Aqueducts become more sophisticated, water clocks more precise. The mechanical knowledge of the ancient world reaches a higher peak. Perhaps most significantly, the library serves as a bridge between different intellectual traditions. Indian mathematical concepts, including early notions of zero and positional notation, arrive via trade routes and are seriously studied by Alexandrian mathematicians. Chinese texts on medicine and natural philosophy make their way westward through Persian intermediaries. The library becomes not just a repository, but a meeting place where different civilizations' knowledge systems encounter each other. By the year 100 CE, the library houses an estimated 600,000 texts, surpassing even its peak in our timeline. The catalog system becomes more sophisticated, essentially creating an early form of systematic bibliography. Scholars can more easily trace the development of ideas across generations. The continuity of intellectual tradition strengthens.
The political implications of a surviving Library of Alexandria become profound as the Roman Empire enters its later phases. In our history, knowledge became increasingly fragmented as the empire faced internal pressures. Here, the continuous operation of the library as a central repository creates different patterns of intellectual and political development. As Christianity spreads through the empire in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, the relationship between emerging Christian thought and classical learning unfolds differently. In our timeline, tensions between pagan philosophy and Christian theology were complicated by the scarcity and dispersal of texts. Here, with the library functioning as a neutral ground for scholarship, Christian theologians have fuller access to philosophical traditions. Clement of Alexandria and Origen, writing in the late 2nd and early 3rd centuries, produce even more sophisticated syntheses of Christian and Platonic thought. This establishes a stronger tradition of rationalist theology earlier in Christian history. The library itself must navigate delicate political waters. As imperial patronage shifts from pagan emperors to Christian ones, the institution evolves. Rather than facing destruction, it transforms. By 325 CE, when Constantine convenes the Council of Nicaea, the library has already become partially Christianized, with new sections devoted to theological works while maintaining its classical collections. The institution survives by becoming indispensable to all parties. Christian bishops want access to its theological library. Pagan philosophers still find refuge in its secular sections. Imperial administrators need its legal and administrative archives. This political adaptation creates a unique hybrid institution. The library remains a center of learning, but it also becomes a site where different religious and philosophical traditions must coexist and engage with each other. Debates that, in our timeline, led to book burnings and suppression of pagan learning here unfold in a more intellectual arena. Not that there is no conflict, there is considerable tension, but the sheer practical value of the library's collections creates incentives for preservation rather than destruction. When the Roman Empire splits into eastern and western halves in the late 4th century, Alexandria's position in the Eastern Empire proves crucial. The library becomes even more central to Byzantine culture. While Western Europe experiences the fragmentation of knowledge during what we call the Dark Ages, the East maintains stronger continuity. The library serves as a bridge, preserving Western texts that might otherwise be lost, while also collecting Eastern Christian works from Syria, Armenia, and Ethiopia. The 7th century brings new political challenges with the rise of Islam. In our timeline, Arab conquest of Alexandria in 641 CE is often associated in later legends with the final destruction of the library. Here, events unfold differently. When Amr ibn al-As conquers Egypt for the Rashidun Caliphate, he finds not ruined buildings but a functioning intellectual center. The early Islamic community, with its own strong emphasis on learning and the collection of knowledge, recognizes value in preservation. The library enters a new phase under Islamic rule. Rather than being destroyed, it is expanded and renamed. It becomes Beit al-Hikmah al-Iskandari, the House of Wisdom of Alexandria, paralleling but predating the famous House of Wisdom that would be established in Baghdad in our timeline. Arab scholars now work alongside Greek, Coptic, and Jewish scholars. The Great Translation movement begins here, decades earlier and more comprehensively than in our history. Greek philosophical and scientific texts are translated into Arabic. Medical knowledge flows between traditions. Mathematical concepts from India receive serious attention from Islamic mathematicians who now have access to the complete works of Greek geometry. This creates a very different political and cultural dynamic in the medieval Islamic world. Learning centers multiply across the caliphate, but Alexandria remains the premier institution. When the Abbasid Caliphate establishes its capital in Baghdad in the 8th century, they create their own House of Wisdom, partly in imitation of Alexandria's model, but the original continues the function. Knowledge flows more freely between the Mediterranean and the Middle East.
In the realm of daily life and culture, the persistent existence of this great center of learning creates subtle but profound changes in how people across multiple civilizations understand their world and themselves. Knowledge that remains centralized and accessible has ways of seeping into the broader culture, changing not just what scholars know, but how ordinary people think. In the cities of the Byzantine Empire, literacy rates gradually climb higher than they did in our timeline. The library sponsors a program of copying important texts for distribution to other cities. Monasteries across the empire receive not just religious texts, but also classical works on agriculture, medicine, and practical crafts. A farmer in Anatolia might not read Aristotle, but the agricultural manual he learns from incorporates principles derived from systematic natural philosophy. A midwife in Constantinople has access to medical knowledge that in our world would have been lost. The preservation of theatrical and poetic works means that classical dramatic traditions continue more robustly. Theaters in major Byzantine cities continue performing not just Christian religious dramas, but also classical Greek plays. This creates a culture that maintains stronger connections to its pre-Christian heritage. The tension between Christian and classical culture exists, certainly, but it is a more creative tension, producing hybrid art forms and literature. In the Islamic world, the effects are even more pronounced. With earlier and more complete access to Greek philosophical and scientific works, Islamic civilization's famous flowering of learning begins earlier and reaches farther. By the 9th century, scholars in Alexandria, Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba are engaged in advanced mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. The concept of the university emerges earlier, with formal institutions of higher learning appearing in multiple cities, all looking to Alexandria as their model. The availability of medical knowledge saves lives in ways difficult to quantify but nonetheless real. Physicians trained in the Alexandrian tradition spread across 3 continents. The medical school associated with the library becomes the premier training ground for doctors. Techniques for surgery, understanding of medicinal plants, principles of hygiene and public health all advance more rapidly. Plague and disease still ravage populations, but mortality rates decline slightly. Life expectancy edges upward by perhaps a few years on average. These small changes accumulate across generations. Language and translation become central to the culture surrounding the library. By necessity, scholars must work across linguistic boundaries. Greek, Latin, Arabic, Coptic, Syriac, Hebrew, Persian, all these languages echo through the library's halls. This creates a cosmopolitan intellectual culture. The practice of translation becomes sophisticated. Concepts from one language and culture must be carefully rendered into another. This act of translation itself becomes a form of philosophy, forcing scholars to think deeply about meaning and understanding. Educational practices shift as well. The library becomes a model for how learning should be organized and transmitted. Students come from across the known world to study in Alexandria. They return home carrying not just knowledge, but also pedagogical methods. The idea of the university, with its organized curriculum and system of degrees, crystallizes earlier and spreads farther. By the 11th century, major cities across the Islamic world and in Christian Europe have established institutions of higher learning modeled partly on Alexandria's example. Women's participation in intellectual life varies by culture and era, but the library's example creates space for female scholars. Following in the tradition of Hypatia, who in our timeline was the last great pagan philosopher of Alexandria before her tragic death, here a continuous line of female mathematicians and philosophers finds space within the institution. They remain exceptional rather than common, but their presence challenges assumptions about women's intellectual capabilities. Their works are copied and distributed, influencing attitudes elsewhere. The aesthetic culture surrounding learning shifts as well. Illuminated manuscripts become more elaborate and beautiful. Library sponsors workshops where artists and scribes create not just functional copies, but works of art. This tradition of beautiful bookmaking spreads influence and artistic development across cultures. The idea that knowledge should be presented beautifully, that learning and aesthetics are connected, becomes more deeply embedded in multiple cultural traditions.
The economic implications of maintaining this vast repository of knowledge ripple through trade networks and resource allocation across the medieval world. Knowledge, particularly practical knowledge, has economic value. Its preservation and dissemination create different patterns of commerce and prosperity. Alexandria itself remains a more significant economic center than in our timeline. The library draws students, scholars, and wealthy patrons from across the known world. This creates a service economy around the institution. Scribes find steady employment copying texts. Translators can make a living facilitating communication between scholars from different regions. Bookbinders, ink makers, papyrus and later parchment suppliers, an entire industry grows around the production and maintenance of manuscripts. The city becomes a hub for what we might call information trade. Rare texts command high prices. Wealthy individuals and institutions pay substantial sums for accurate copies of important works. This creates incentives for merchants to bring new texts from distant lands. A trader returning from India or China knows that unusual manuscripts might fetch better prices than silk or spices. The library's buyers actively seek out foreign texts, funneling money into long-distance trade networks. Agricultural productivity benefits from the preservation and distribution of practical texts. Roman agricultural manuals, Greek natural histories, Egyptian farming techniques developed over millennia, all this knowledge remains accessible and continues to be refined. Treatises on crop rotation, soil management, irrigation, and animal husbandry circulate more widely. Landowners who can read or employ educated stewards achieve slightly better yields. Over generations, these small improvements compound. Famines still occur, but food security improves marginally in regions where agricultural knowledge spreads. The Islamic Golden Age, which in our timeline was already remarkable for its economic prosperity and scientific advancement, reaches even greater heights. With earlier access to Greek, mathematical, and astronomical works, Islamic scholars make breakthroughs in algebra and trigonometry even earlier. These mathematical advances have practical applications in commerce, architecture, and navigation. Merchants can calculate profits and losses more accurately. Architects design more ambitious structures. Navigators chart courses more precisely. The technology of papermaking, which spread from China through the Islamic world in our timeline, is adopted even more rapidly here. The library's enormous appetite for writing materials creates strong economic incentives to find cheaper alternatives to parchment. When papermaking technology arrives from Central Asia in the 8th century, the library's administrators immediately recognize its potential. They invest in paper mills and refine the technology. By the 9th century, paper has become widespread across the Islamic world and begins spreading into Christian Europe via Spain and Sicily. The lower cost of paper further accelerates the production and distribution of books, creating a positive feedback loop of spreading literacy and knowledge. Maritime trade benefits significantly from advanced geographical and navigational knowledge. Greek geographical texts, updated with new information from Arab and Persian travelers, give merchants better understanding of trade routes and distant markets. Astronomical tables allow for more accurate navigation. Ship design improves as principles of engineering preserved from ancient texts on maritime technology. The classic dhow design of Arab traders incorporates refinements suggested by ancient Greek texts on hydrodynamics that in our world were lost. The trade routes themselves shift somewhat. Alexandria remains a crucial node connecting Mediterranean, Red Sea, and overland routes to Asia. In our timeline, the city declined in relative importance during the medieval period. Here, its role as an intellectual capital reinforces its commercial significance. Merchants know that Alexandria is where you can find not just goods, but also information. Scribes work there. Translators for obscure languages can be hired. Letters of credit and other financial instruments are understood and honored. The city becomes a medieval information technology hub. Banking and finance develop more sophisticated mathematical foundations earlier. Islamic scholars at the library, working with both Greek and Indian mathematical traditions, develop more advanced algebraic techniques. These find application in calculating interest, managing risk, and handling complex commercial transactions. The financial innovations that in our timeline emerged during the Italian Renaissance appears centuries earlier. This doesn't create modern capitalism, but it does make medieval commerce somewhat more efficient and sophisticated. The economics of knowledge production creates new social classes. Professional scholars, scribes, translators, and teachers form a distinct educated class with its own economic interests. They're not quite like the later European bourgeoisie, but they occupy an interesting middle space between traditional aristocracy and common laborers. This educated professional class has influence beyond its numbers, serving as advisors to rulers, administrators of institutions, and links between different cultural worlds. Mining and metallurgy advance more rapidly with the preservation of ancient texts on these subjects. Treatises on identifying ore deposits, extracting metals, and creating alloys remain in circulation. This leads to slightly more efficient exploitation of mineral resources. The quality of steel improves somewhat earlier. Coinage becomes more standardized and reliable. These changes are subtle but economically significant over centuries. In the realm of science and technology, the unbroken continuity of learning produces perhaps the most dramatic divergences from our timeline. Knowledge builds on knowledge. Each generation of scholars can access the complete works of previous generations, can build systematically on existing foundations rather than having to reconstruct lost discoveries. By the year 800, natural philosophy in the Islamic world has already surpassed what would not be achieved in our timeline until the European Renaissance. The complete preservation of Archimedes' works, including treatises that were lost in our world, gives medieval mathematicians and engineers a more sophisticated foundation. His method of exhaustion, a precursor to integral calculus, is studied and extended. By the 10th century, an Egyptian mathematician named Al-Kasi has developed concepts that approached differential calculus centuries before Newton and Leibniz. Astronomy advances dramatically. With continuous observations recorded over more than 1,000 years, patterns invisible to shorter timescales become apparent. A Persian astronomer working in Alexandria in the 11th century, building on this vast database of observations, develops a heliocentric model of the solar system that is both more complete than Copernicus's version in our timeline and appears nearly 5 centuries earlier. His model still has imperfections. He retains circular rather than elliptical orbits, but it correctly places the Sun at the center and accurately predicts planetary positions. This astronomical revolution doesn't immediately overthrow all religious cosmology, but it creates intense intellectual debate. Islamic scholars grapple with reconciling Quranic verses with heliocentrism. Christian theologians in Byzantium and eventually Western Europe must do the same. The controversy is real and sometimes bitter, but because the transition happens more gradually over centuries rather than suddenly, accommodation is eventually reached. Religious authorities in multiple traditions develop interpretive frameworks that accept heliocentrism while maintaining theological positions. Optics and the study of light advance rapidly. Building on the work of ancient Greek scholars and adding observations and experiments by Islamic scientists, a complete theory of vision emerges. The camera obscura is well understood. Lenses are crafted with increasing precision. By the 12th century, primitive telescopes exist, though they're rare and expensive. These early telescopes, still crude by later standards, nonetheless allow astronomers to make observations impossible with the naked eye. The moons of Jupiter are discovered. Saturn's rings are glimpsed, though not yet understood. Medicine achieves breakthroughs that save countless lives. The continuous operation of the Alexandrian medical school means that anatomical knowledge advances more steadily. Dissection, controversial but tolerated within the library's walls under both Islamic and earlier Christian rule, provides increasingly detailed understanding of human physiology. By the year 1000, physicians have a fairly accurate understanding of the circulatory system, predating William Harvey's discoveries in our timeline by more than 6 centuries. The connection between germs and disease is not yet fully understood. That requires microscopes and a different conceptual framework, but their hygiene practices based on empirical observation reduced infection rates. Physicians trained in Alexandria know to wash hands and instruments. They understand that some diseases spread through contact or contaminated water. Public health measures in cities influenced by Alexandrian medicine are more effective. Quarantine during plague outbreaks is practiced more systematically and somewhat more successfully. Chemistry, or alchemy as it's still called, becomes more systematic and experimental. The laboratory techniques developed in Alexandria, distillation, crystallization, solution, filtration, are refined and standardized. While still mixed with mystical elements and the search for transmutation, the practice becomes more empirical. A foundation is being laid for what will eventually become modern chemistry, and it's being laid centuries earlier than in our timeline. Engineering benefits enormously from preserved ancient texts. Vitruvius's work on architecture, Hero's pneumatic and hydraulic devices, Archimedes' mechanical principles all remain available and are studied, extended, and applied. Watermills become more efficient. Windmills appear earlier and spread faster. Architectural techniques allow for larger domes and longer unsupported spans. The Great Mosque of Alexandria, constructed in the 9th century, features a dome that rivals Hagia Sophia, built using principles from both Roman engineering texts and innovations developed by Islamic architects. Perhaps most intriguingly, experimental method develops earlier. The emphasis on empirical observation present in some ancient texts is preserved and emphasized. Islamic scholars, particularly those working in optical science, develop something approaching the modern scientific method. The idea that theories must be tested through careful experiment, that observations should be reproducible, that natural explanations should be sought for natural phenomena, these principles crystallize earlier and spread more widely. This doesn't mean a full scientific revolution occurs in the medieval period. The conceptual breakthroughs that mark modern science still require social and economic conditions that don't yet exist. But the groundwork is laid more solidly. Scientific thinking becomes more prestigious and widespread. The attitude of systematic inquiry, of learning through observation and experiment rather than relying solely on authority and tradition, takes root in multiple intellectual cultures.
The effects of Alexandria's surviving library radiate outward, touching civilizations far from the Mediterranean and reshaping the medieval and early modern world in profound ways. Knowledge, like water finding its level, flows along trade routes and cultural connections, carrying with it seeds of change. In Western Europe, which in our timeline experienced a more severe intellectual decline during the early medieval period, the differences become apparent by the 10th and 11th centuries. Texts that were lost in our world remain available in copies that traveled westward through Spain, Sicily, and Byzantium. The Carolingian Renaissance of the 8th and 9th centuries is richer, with access to more complete classical texts. Scholars in monasteries from Ireland to Italy gradually accumulate better libraries. The process is still slow and limited by the relative poverty and political fragmentation of early medieval Europe, but it is noticeably better than our timeline.
By the year 1000, cathedral schools in major European cities have copies of texts that, in our world, wouldn't be rediscovered until the Renaissance. Aristotle's complete works are available in Latin translation by 1100. This changes the intellectual development of medieval Europe, allowing scholasticism to develop earlier and reach further. The Crusades, when they occur in the late 11th century, take on slightly different character. European knights and pilgrims traveling east encounter not just military opponents, but also a more obviously sophisticated Islamic civilization, with its intellectual center still in Alexandria. Some crusaders, particularly educated ones, are impressed by the libraries and learning institutions they encounter. When they return west, they bring not just goods, but also books and ideas. The cultural exchange, while still occurring in the context of military conflict, is somewhat richer. The relationship between Christian and Islamic civilizations is no less complex or conflict-ridden than in our timeline, but there are more points of intellectual contact. Scholars on both sides have greater awareness of each other's achievements. The translation movement that brought Greek texts into Latin in our 12th century Renaissance of Europe happens earlier and more comprehensively. European scholars begin traveling to Alexandria itself, despite the religious and political barriers drawn by the library's reputation. In India and East Asia, the effects are more subtle but still significant. Indian mathematical concepts, particularly the decimal system and concept of zero, reach the Mediterranean earlier and are quickly recognized for their revolutionary potential. Alexandrian mathematicians adopt and spread these innovations. By the 11th century, what we call Arabic numerals are already beginning to replace Roman numerals in commercial calculations across the Islamic world and are starting to appear in European merchant cities. The Silk Road trade routes carry knowledge along with silk and spices. Chinese inventions, paper, gunpowder, the compass, printing, still originate in China, but their westward spread is somewhat accelerated by the active seeking of knowledge by Alexandrian scholars and their networks. When movable type printing technology reaches the Middle East in the 13th century, it encounters a civilization already primed to appreciate its revolutionary potential. In the 14th and 15th centuries, as Europe begins to emerge from the medieval period, the differences from our timeline become striking. The Italian Renaissance still occurs, driven by similar economic and social factors, but it has more complete access to classical sources from the beginning. Humanist scholars don't need to hunt for lost manuscripts or rely on fragmentary texts. The complete works of ancient authors are available in Latin and Greek and are being translated into Latin and Italian. This doesn't make the Renaissance less significant, but it does change its character somewhat. There was less sense of recovering a lost past and more sense of continuing a living tradition. European scholars are more aware that intellectual development never really stopped, it just shifted east. This creates both humility and ambition. European thinkers know they are entering into ongoing conversations that have continued for centuries without them, and they are eager to contribute. The printing press, invented in Europe in the mid-15th century in our timeline, still appears around the same time, but it immediately finds more material to print. The flood of books that marks the print revolution is even more dramatic. Not just contemporary works and rediscovered classics, but centuries of Islamic scientific and philosophical works suddenly become available to European readers in vernacular translations. The intellectual ferment is extraordinary.
By the 16th and 17th centuries, the world that has emerged from this different history is recognizable, but distinctly altered. The Great Library still stands in Alexandria, though the city and region have passed through many rulers. The institution has survived Ottoman conquest in 1517, adapting once again, becoming a site where Ottoman, Persian, Arab, and eventually European scholars continue to meet and work. The Protestant Reformation occurs in Europe, driven by many of the same theological and political factors as in our timeline, but the intellectual context is different.
Luther, Calvin, and other reformers are products of a European intellectual culture that has been in closer and earlier contact with Greek patristic texts and philosophical traditions. The debates that animate the Reformation are informed by deeper engagement with early Christian sources. The Council of Trent and the Catholic response similarly draw on a richer theological library. The scientific revolution of the 17th century, which in our world marked such a dramatic break with medieval thought, here is more clearly a culmination of longer developments. Galileo, working in the early 1600s, is building on heliocentrism that has been debated for centuries. His telescopic observations confirm what some have already suspected. Newton's great synthesis of physics and mathematics in the late 1600s draws on a longer tradition of mathematical physics that traces back through Kepler and Galileo, but also through Islamic mathematicians back to the unbroken tradition of Greek geometry and mechanics. This doesn't diminish these achievements. If anything, Newton's synthesis is even more comprehensive because he has more to synthesize. But it means science develops somewhat more continuously and less revolutionarily. There are fewer dramatic paradigm shifts and more steady accumulation. The metaphor of standing on the shoulders of giants, which Newton used, is even more appropriate in this timeline. The age of exploration is similarly affected. European navigators in the 15th and 16th centuries have access to better maps, more accurate astronomical tables, and superior navigational techniques. Columbus's voyage still happens, the political and economic motivations remain, but he has better data about ocean currents and prevailing winds. The colonization of the Americas proceeds, with all its tragedy and horror, not fundamentally changed by the survival of an ancient library, but perhaps marginally more informed. The Ottoman Empire, which controlled Egypt and thus Alexandria from the 16th century through World War I in our timeline, here maintains the library as a showpiece institution. Ottoman scholars contribute to its collections. The empire's relative decline vis-à-vis Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries still occurs, but Ottoman intellectual culture remains somewhat more vibrant. The Tanzimat reforms of the 19th century, which tried to modernize the empire, have deeper indigenous intellectual roots to draw on. European colonialism still expands across the globe in the 18th and 19th centuries, driven by superior military technology and ruthless exploitation. The library and its traditions don't prevent this, but they do create different patterns of cultural encounter. When Napoleon invades Egypt in 1798, he finds not a decayed institution, but a still functioning center of learning. The French scholars who accompany his expedition engage with Egyptian counterparts who are not simply guardians of dead traditions, but participants in living intellectual culture. The infamous cultural appropriation and looting still occur, but there is also more genuine exchange. The Industrial Revolution transforms Britain and Europe beginning in the late 18th century. This economic and technological transformation is driven primarily by social, economic, and political factors specific to Europe. However, the scientific foundations that make it possible have been building on a more complete knowledge base. Thermodynamics, chemistry, and metallurgy all benefit from longer traditions of systematic study. The revolution perhaps comes slightly earlier or proceeds somewhat faster because the necessary scientific groundwork is more developed. By the 19th century, Alexandria and its library have become symbols and objects of fascination for European and American scholars. The growing field of Oriental studies, problematic as its assumptions and power dynamics are, at least deals with an institution that embodies centuries of knowledge exchange between civilizations. Scholars from Oxford and Harvard make pilgrimages to study there, despite the political complexities of the late Ottoman period.
The 20th century brings both world wars. Egypt's strategic location means it cannot escape the global conflicts. But through both wars, extraordinary efforts are made to protect the library. In World War I, when British and Ottoman forces clash in the region, both sides issue orders to their troops to avoid damage to the library district. In World War II, even as Alexandria faces the threat of Axis invasion during the North African campaign, plans are made to evacuate the most precious manuscripts. Independence movements sweep the colonial world in the mid-20th century. Egypt gains independence, and the library becomes a point of national pride for the emerging nation. It is restored and modernized. Microclimate-controlled rooms protect ancient manuscripts. Microfilming and later digitization begin to make the collections accessible to the entire world. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the library becomes a UNESCO World Heritage Site and a symbol of international scholarly cooperation. Scholars from every nation work in its archives. The continuous tradition of learning spanning more than 2,000 years without significant interruption stands as testament to human capability for preserving and building upon knowledge across generations, cultures, and civilizations.
To understand how different this world is from our own, we must quietly consider what was lost in our timeline and preserved in this alternate history. In the world we actually inhabit, much of ancient knowledge was indeed lost. Libraries burned, manuscripts crumbled, languages died, and civilizations fell. The European Renaissance was, in significant part, a project of recovery, of finding fragments and trying to piece together what had once been known. In our world, Greek science and philosophy survived largely through Arabic translations. Islamic scholars preserved and built upon classical knowledge during Europe's early medieval period. This actually happened, and we owe an immense debt to that preservation. But even this transmission was incomplete. Many works survived only in fragments or summaries. Some disappeared entirely, known only through references in other texts. The great library of Alexandria in our timeline did gradually decline and eventually cease to exist as a functioning institution. The exact details of its end remain debated. There was no single burning, but rather a long decline through damage, neglect, changing priorities, and religious and political upheaval. By the time of the Muslim conquest of Egypt in the 7th century, the library was probably already largely gone, making the famous story of Caliph Umar ordering its destruction almost certainly legendary. The loss affected human development in ways difficult to fully measure. Scientific progress in Europe stagnated for centuries. Medical knowledge declined. Techniques of surgery understood in the ancient world were forgotten and not rediscovered until the Renaissance or later. Mathematical concepts had to be painfully reconstructed. The heliocentric model of the solar system, proposed by Aristarchus in ancient times, was lost and had to wait for Copernicus to propose it again 17 centuries later. The Islamic Golden Age did happen in our world and did produce extraordinary achievements in science, mathematics, medicine, and philosophy. But imagine if it had started even earlier, with even more complete access to ancient sources. Imagine if there had been no break in the chain of learning, no centuries of having to reconstruct lost knowledge before new advances could be made. In our world, the translation of Arabic texts into Latin in medieval Europe was crucial to the development of modern science. But it was a difficult, incomplete process, hampered by linguistic barriers, religious prejudices, and the simple unavailability of many texts. The alternate history we have explored imagines a fuller, richer transmission of knowledge across cultures and centuries. Consider also what might be different in terms of cultural development. In our world, there has often been a sense of disconnection between civilizations, a feeling that Islamic, Chinese, Indian, and European intellectual traditions developed largely in isolation,
In reality, there was always more exchange than is commonly recognized, but it was limited. The alternate world we have imagined, with its continuous center of learning drawing from multiple traditions, might have developed a more cosmopolitan intellectual culture earlier, a greater sense of shared human knowledge transcending particular civilizations. Yet, we must also acknowledge what wouldn't change. Human nature remains human nature. Wars would still be fought. Empires would still rise and fall. Inequality, injustice, and suffering would still mark human experience. A library, no matter how grand, doesn't prevent famine or cure plague or stop conquest. Technology and knowledge can be used for good or ill. The Industrial Revolution might come earlier in this alternate history, but it would still bring both progress and exploitation. Colonialism might be informed by more cross-cultural knowledge, but it would still be driven by greed and power. The 20th century's terrible wars would still, in all likelihood, occur, though perhaps the weapons used and strategies employed might differ in details. What does change is the continuity of human intellectual achievement. In this alternate world, there is a thread running unbroken from ancient times to the present, a tradition of learning and scholarship that transcends any single culture or civilization. That continuity would be precious, not because it solves all human problems, but because it represents humanity's better impulses, the desire to understand, to preserve what has been learned, to build on the foundations of previous generations.
As you lie there now, in whatever time and place you find yourself, consider what we have journeyed through together. An ancient library survives, knowledge persists, traditions continue, and from this one change, preserved scrolls in fireproof rooms, an entire different history unfolds. Not necessarily better in all ways, not free from suffering or conflict, but different in its intellectual continuity, in its preservation of human achievement across the generations. The real Library of Alexandria is gone. We cannot recover what was lost, but perhaps imagining its survival helps us appreciate what we do have, the libraries and universities and research institutions of our own world. The internet that makes knowledge more accessible than ever before in human history. The ongoing project of human learning that continues despite all obstacles. In our world, knowledge has survived against all odds. Despite wars, despite book burnings, despite the rise and fall of civilizations, human beings have persisted in learning, in preserving what previous generations discovered, in adding their own contributions. The chain has been broken many times, but it has always been reforged. Perhaps that repeated rebuilding, that stubborn refusal to let knowledge die, even when institutions fall, is as impressive as the unbroken continuity we have imagined tonight. What does it mean to preserve knowledge? What responsibility do we have to both past and future? The ancients who collected scrolls in Alexandria believed that knowledge was precious, worth protecting and passing on. The medieval scholars who studied by candlelight, whether in Baghdad or Cordoba or Paris or Constantinople, believed the same. The scientists and teachers and librarians of our own time continue that tradition. Knowledge is fragile. Libraries burn. Hard drives fail. Civilizations fall. And yet knowledge is also resilient, because human curiosity is resilient. As long as people ask questions and seek answers, as long as we care about preserving what we learn and teaching the next generation, the project continues. Perhaps the point of this thought experiment, this imagining of what might have been, is not really about the past at all. Perhaps it's about the present and future. What knowledge are we preserving today?
What are we learning and creating that future generations will be grateful to receive? What institutions are we maintaining that will outlast us? The Great Library still exists, in a way, in every library and university, in every database and digital archive, in every classroom where a teacher shares knowledge with students. The dream of Alexandria, of gathering the world's knowledge in one place and making it available to all who seek it, has been partially realized through modern technology. We live in an age where more information is accessible to more people than ever before in history. And yet we also live in an age where misinformation spreads rapidly, where anti-intellectual currents run strong, where the very concept of expertise and careful study is sometimes questioned. The work of preserving and extending human knowledge is never finished. Each generation must take up the task anew. As you drift towards sleep now, wherever you are, let your mind rest on these thoughts. An ancient library glowing with lamplight, scholars bent over precious manuscripts, the accumulated wisdom of centuries carefully preserved. It's a beautiful image, and while that particular library is lost to us, what it represented, humanity's desire to learn and preserve and grow in understanding, that spirit survives. May you sleep well, dreaming perhaps of libraries and lost knowledge, of continuity and change, of all the paths history might have taken and the one it did. And when you wake, may you carry forward in your own small way the work of learning, of questioning, of preserving and extending human knowledge. The great project continues, and each of us is part of it. Rest now. Tomorrow brings new questions, new discoveries, new opportunities to learn. But for now, sleep, and let these thoughts of alternative histories settle gently into your mind, like dust on ancient scrolls, preserved through the ages, waiting to be read again. Good night, wherever you are. Thank you for listening. Until we meet again to explore the endless possibilities of what might have been.